In early December, I decided to go out for some late-night shopping. As a 31-year-old stay-at-home mom of 2 young kids, I often take the opportunity to unwind and run errands on my own once my husband gets home from work. That night, I headed to my usual Target around 8:30 p.m. The parking lot was mostly empty, which I attributed to it being a weekday evening. While I'm not generally an anxious person, I've attended seminars on human trafficking and have done a fair amount of personal research on how to stay safe when out alone, especially at night. I always carry a few self-defense items with me, a Cubiton, an alarm, and a universal handcuff key. After parking near the front of the store and making note of the cars nearby, I walked in and began browsing. About 10 to 15 minutes into my shopping, I noticed a tall, thin young man in a dirty gray sweatsuit and brown work boots. He glanced at me, and I smiled, but he gave no reaction. He seemed distant, possibly under the influence of something. What caught my attention was that he had no cart, no basket, and seemed to be wandering aimlessly. Still, I brushed it off and continued shopping. Not long after, I spotted another man dressed similarly in a gray sweatsuit and work boots. He, too, had no cart or basket and avoided eye contact when I looked his way. At this point, I started paying closer attention but remained calm. A little later, I saw a third man wearing the same kind of outfit and boots. Like the others, he also wandered without any shopping items. My first thought was that they might be in some sort of work uniform, but their behavior seemed off. Why weren't they together, and why did none of them have anything to purchase? Over the next 20 minutes, I became increasingly uneasy. It felt as if the 3 men were tracking my movements, passing by whatever aisle I was in. I decided to test my suspicions by moving randomly between departments to see if they continued to show up. Sure enough, no matter where I went, one of them would eventually pass by, making their presence known. Their behavior was no longer subtle, and an overwhelming sense of dread crept over me. Feeling more annoyed than scared, I decided it was time to leave. On my way to checkout, I noticed one of the men walking quickly behind me. I abruptly stopped, turned, and locked eyes with him. His dark, unsettling gaze and sinister smirk sent a shiver down my spine. He nudged my shoulder as he walked past, holding eye contact as he backed out of the store. The whole encounter left me shaken. I discreetly told the cashier what had been happening and asked to speak to a manager. The manager's expression made it clear she recognized the men I described. She explained that the store's female employees had also found them disturbing in the past and assured me the incident would be reported. She arranged for a male employee to escort me to my car. As we stepped outside, my worst fears were confirmed. A white, windowless van was parked 3 spaces behind my car. One of the men sat in the driver's seat while the other 2 leaned against the van, partially hidden. When I pointed them out to the employee, they quickly jumped into the van and sped off. Reflecting on the situation, I couldn't shake the feeling of how close I had come to danger. Over the next week, I learned there had been several attempted abductions in a nearby shopping center, and I strongly suspect the same men were involved. Thankfully, I made it home safely that night, but the experience is a sobering reminder to trust your instincts and stay vigilant. In the early 2000s, my family lived in Europe. In December 2001, we flew back to Latin America for Christmas. My brother and I, both high school students, were traveling with our dad from Paris to Miami. Dad sat in business class while my brother and I were in coach, seated in the middle row. The flight started uneventfully. About 4 or 5 hours in, I was reading a book and drifting off when I heard a woman repeatedly saying, "No." At first, it was barely audible, but it quickly escalated to frantic, panicked screams of, "No, no, no." I glanced up and saw a flight attendant leaning over someone in a window seat several rows ahead. Initially, I thought it might be a medical emergency, but her screaming felt far too intense for that. For a moment, everything seemed frozen. Passengers didn't react immediately. I stayed rooted in my seat, overwhelmed with panic, but my brother leaped into action. He jumped over the aisle passenger and rushed toward the commotion. In seconds, he was up there, while others started standing to see what was happening. The woman continued screaming, now struggling with a man. He was tall, with long curly black hair that stood out even above the seat backs. My brother returned briefly to tell me, "Something's wrong," before heading back to help. More passengers joined the effort to subdue the man. Someone from the row behind him yanked his hair, jerking his head backward. He let out a guttural moan, and chaos erupted. The aisles became crowded, making movement impossible. I saw a fire extinguisher being passed forward and feared there was a fire on board, imagining the worst. The extinguisher was handed to a male flight attendant near the man, who used it to strike him in the face, hard. The crew began asking passengers for belts, headphone cords, or anything that could serve as restraints. My brother gave up his belt, which, along with other items, was used to secure the man's arms, shoulders, and torso to the seat. I noticed the same flight attendant later carrying a pair of large black tennis shoes to the back of the plane, which struck me as odd at the time. The attendants asked if there was a doctor on board to sedate the man. People also asked if there was an air marshal present, but no one came forward. The situation eventually stabilized, and passengers were told to return to their seats. A few people who had helped restrain the man were assigned to watch over him in shifts, with someone even holding his hair from behind to prevent further movement. Over the intercom, the pilot referred vaguely to a security breach, cautioning us to get to know your neighbors, suggesting uncertainty about whether the man acted alone. Tension filled the cabin as we remained over the Atlantic with several hours left before landing. Despite the fear, passengers tried to stay positive, and the crew even put on Legally Blonde to lighten the mood. Still, rules were strictly enforced, bathroom visits required an attendant escort, and the doors couldn't be locked. A stubborn French passenger repeatedly ignored the restrictions, frustrating the crew. As we neared the US, we noticed fighter jets flying alongside the plane. The pilot announced they were escorting us to Boston Logan Airport. While some children excitedly watched the jets, I later learned they were there to prevent another 9/11-style attack and were authorized to shoot us down if necessary. After landing, the plane remained on the tarmac for hours. A SWAT team boarded, armed and in full tactical gear. They cut the man free from his restraints and took him off the plane. Sitting just a few rows away, I had a clear view of everything. We were eventually moved to a baggage claim area, where we waited for hours without explanation. Tempers flared as passengers, including crying children, grew frustrated with the lack of communication. Finally, pizzas were brought in, and we were moved to a more comfortable waiting area. The FBI interrogated each passenger, searching for accomplices. They were stern and methodical, inspecting everyone's shoes, luggage, and carry-ons while conducting pat-downs. It wasn't until we were allowed to call home that we learned the truth: the man had attempted to detonate a shoe bomb mid-flight. My dad, brother, and I had remained surprisingly calm throughout the ordeal, not realizing just how close we had come to disaster. After about 12 hours in Boston, we were placed on another flight. Upon arriving home, my brother, who had spoken to CNN and other media outlets during the layover, was swarmed by reporters. He gave more interviews despite his exhaustion. Later, we learned the man was Richard Reed, a would-be terrorist whose plan had been thwarted partly because his shoe bomb's wick was too damp to ignite, thanks to rain in Paris. He had initially tried to board the flight a day earlier but was delayed due to French security concerns. Reed is now serving 3 life sentences in prison, but the events of that flight remain etched in my memory as one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. My dad travels often for work and has accumulated a lot of Delta miles. As an early Christmas gift, he and my mom used those miles to buy me a ticket from Oregon to Montana so I could visit my boyfriend during his finals week. My own finals had ended a week earlier, so it was the perfect opportunity. Luckily, we drove back to Oregon together for his winter break, which meant I didn't have to deal with flying home. This was my first time flying alone, and the only time I planned to make this trip by air since my boyfriend usually drives home during school breaks. I had a 2-hour layover in Salt Lake City before my connecting flight to Montana. To pass the time, I sat alone near my gate, charging my phone and scrolling through Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat. The seating area was lined with tables along the windows, giving a view of parked airplanes and those taxiing on the runway. Large decorative plants were placed between the tables, which were mostly occupied by 1 or 2 people. As I sat there, a man approached me. He looked to be in his mid-20s, wasn't very tall, wore a long dark coat, and carried only a backpack. Something about his demeanor felt off, though I didn't notice right away. It was only when I looked into his eyes, one of which seemed misaligned, that I felt uneasy. Not wanting to judge him for something he couldn't control, I greeted him politely when he said hello and introduced himself. He extended 2 fingers for me to shake, which struck me as odd, but I went along with it. He then sat down across from me, placing his backpack on the ground by his chair. He started pointing at the airplanes outside and muttering under his breath, seemingly naming models or saying numbers that made no sense to me. His voice was slurred and difficult to understand. I smiled politely, trying to appear interested, but soon returned to scrolling through my phone. That's when he told me I was beautiful and asked if I had a boyfriend. I answered yes, and he began probing further, asking if we lived together. I replied no and explained I was on my way to visit him. The man asked where my boyfriend was, and I mentioned he was in Montana for school. He continued asking personal questions, like whether we were in a long-distance relationship, to which I said yes but clarified it was only temporary until my boyfriend graduated in May. Then, unprompted, he began telling me I was wasting my time and money on a long-distance relationship, going so far as to say that we would break up. His comments infuriated me, as he knew nothing about my life or my relationship. I looked him in the eye and firmly told him to leave. He asked why, and I repeated that I didn't want him there. Despite my growing panic, he kept making remarks about my relationship, ignoring my requests for him to leave. The situation escalated as I started yelling at him to go, drawing the attention of passers-by. This only made me more anxious since I don't like being the center of attention in public. Finally, the man picked up his bag and said he would leave, though he claimed not to understand why I was upset. He extended his 2 fingers again for a goodbye shake, but I screamed, "Don't touch me." As he stood up, he called me stupid and added, "Good luck on the breakup," before walking away. I shouted for him to shut up, but he muttered something I didn't catch as he disappeared. Shaken, I immediately called my boyfriend, crying, to tell him what had happened. Then I called my mom, who advised me that I should have walked away and sought security if he had followed me. At the moment, though, it was hard to think clearly or remember my options. Later, as I made my way to my gate, I saw him talking to another girl who was sitting alone. He was introducing himself to her in the same odd manner. I couldn't understand why he was doing this at an airport. While I don't want to make assumptions about his mental state or whether he was under the influence of something, the encounter left me deeply unsettled. This strange series of events spanned an entire year, with the last incident occurring in December 2016. At the time, I owned a green 1998 Toyota Camry. It had originally belonged to my grandmother, who passed it down to my parents before it eventually became my first car. It was dependable, though I had a bad habit of letting clutter accumulate inside before finally cleaning it out. Since I still lived with my parents, they occasionally used the car when they needed it. One day, during a rare cleaning session, I noticed a tangle of fishing lines with hooks in the back of my car. Some hooks were stuck in the upholstery, while others were lodged between the seat creases. It took quite a bit of effort to remove them all, and I almost pricked myself several times in the process. I wasn't sure how long they'd been there, as it had been months since I had done a thorough cleaning. At first, I thought my dad might have put them there, as he had recently borrowed the car to haul some items for a garage sale. When I asked him about it, though, he denied ever seeing fishing hooks or lines in the car. This confused me, as no one in my family fishes. My dad was also the only person who had used my car in the past year or so. I'm the type who is meticulous about locking up, triple-checking my car doors and parking where I can see the vehicle from my bedroom window. The possibility of someone breaking in seemed unlikely. Without any other explanation, I brushed it off as something my dad might have overlooked. Then, about a month later, I discovered more fishing hooks in the back seat. This time, I was genuinely unnerved. When I brought it up to my dad again, he suggested that either I was playing some sort of strange prank, or someone might actually be breaking into the car. However, none of this made sense. Why would anyone break in and leave fishing hooks without stealing anything? To provide some context, I lived in a tight-knit neighborhood where everyone knew each other. We even had a private Facebook group used as a neighborhood watch. It seemed highly unlikely that anyone nearby would do something so bizarre. Yet, without a motive or any clear explanation, the strange occurrences faded to the back of my mind as weeks passed. During this time, I got a new job selling mattresses after being unemployed while focusing on school. I also moved out of my parents' house to live with my girlfriend. That's when the situation escalated from peculiar to outright disturbing. One evening, my girlfriend and I decided to go grocery shopping. Before leaving, I noticed fishing lines and hooks scattered in the back seat of my car again. Startled, I quickly scanned the area for signs of someone lurking nearby. I told my girlfriend to go back inside, and I stayed up all night, keeping a watchful eye on my car from our bedroom window after double-checking that everything was locked. The next morning, we resumed our normal routines. My store had a unique L-shaped layout, with two entrances separated by a cafe in the middle. One entrance was visible from the front desk, but the other required stepping away to check. One evening, as I was closing up after a quiet day, I noticed a roll of fishing line in the middle of the hallway leading to the obscured entrance. The line was partially unrolled, with hooks arranged near the door. To my horror, I realized someone had disabled the door alarm. Only my coworker and I had access to it, and neither of us had ever touched the device. At that moment, it hit me, someone had been stalking me and leaving these fishing lines as a message, or a warning. I was terrified but felt helpless. There was no physical evidence to identify the culprit, and my store lacked security cameras. Corporate wouldn't approve installing them, and neither my family nor my girlfriend's family could afford to set up cameras of their own. My only option was to act as though these incidents didn't affect me, hoping the person would lose interest and stop. But they didn't stop. Over the next few months, I continued to find fishing lines and hooks in my car, even though I kept it locked at all times. The only people with spare keys were my parents, who were too preoccupied with work and building their new home to be involved in any elaborate prank. I even left notes in my car asking the person to stop, but while the notes disappeared along with each new incident, no response ever came. The most terrifying moment came after I moved in with some friends temporarily. One evening, I returned from work to find fishing lines and hooks strewn about their living room. Furniture was overturned, and a few items were broken, but nothing had been stolen. My friends and their baby weren't home at the time, and the only witnesses were their cats, which were so spooked they hid under the bed for hours. To this day, I don't know who was responsible for stalking me or why they chose fishing lines and hooks as their calling card. I don't have enemies, and I go out of my way to avoid conflict with others. Whether it was someone I knew or a stranger, they were disturbingly good at covering their tracks. The incidents have left me with lingering anxiety. I struggle to sleep at night, hyper-aware of every sound, and though it's been nearly 9 months since the last incident, the silence is unsettling. Knowing someone followed me through so many changes in my life without ever escalating beyond this bizarre harassment makes me uneasy. They could strike again at any time.